haven't been here.
So here's what happened. Wait.
I went to the old building.
Get two more? Thank you. Yeah, I've never been here.
I was telling them about the National Trust.
You went to the old building?
Did you?
Is
I
the-
went to the old one. I was like trying to get through the construction site.
It's a metaphor.
Exactly.
How clever of Rick to do this. Hold it there.
Well, thanks to everybody for joining. I hope you can all hear me, that my mic is operational. And thank you for coming on this afternoon, and please avail yourself of the wine and cheese. We had the choice of either serving tea and coffee and waiting for the wine till later. We're uncorking the wine now, and Doug and I unanimously decided to uncork the wine at this stage. So please, thank you.
My work here is done.
We thought we would look better if you had some wine prior to this. And congratulations to AEI for this new, beautiful facility and for moving in here recently into the stunning historic building that you're sitting in, which used to be Andrew Mellon's residence, I think back when he was Treasury Secretary and prior to that. So I hope you get a chance to look around. It really is beautiful. My guess is if Andrew Mellon could come back and take a look at this, he'd probably say, man, what is their electric bill, given what we have here? But it is a stunningly beautiful thing. And many thanks to Kavya, whereas Kavya Ramesh was here. She helped organize this event at AEI, and I'm very grateful to her and all the support staff that are here. And grateful for them. I did want to, a couple of my students are here from Cornell. Milica Petrovic, did I get that pronunciation? Milica, stand up, is from Montenegro. And she's very interested in the water system, water infrastructure there. And she is a Hubert Humphrey Fellow, if I recall, right? So if you have any interest in water infrastructure, please, and water public-private partnerships, please talk to her. And then Sanjeev is here as well from Nepal, who is also a student from Cornell. I'm very grateful to you both for attending. So please chat with them after this. Thanks a lot. So what I'll do is, in the interest of time, our goal is to maximize interaction both amongst the panelists and between you all and the panelists, is to just go right down the line here. I guess I'll introduce myself in case people don't recognize me. I'm Rick Geddes, and I'm a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, but I also have a night job, which is as a professor of policy analysis and management, or PAM, at Cornell University, which actually, if people know the structure of Cornell, sits within the College of Human Ecology, which used to be the Women's College at Cornell. And I am the founding director of something called the Cornell Program in Infrastructure Policy, or CPIP is the acronym. And I actually have some information on CPIP here at this table to tell you what we're trying to do about educating the future generation of infrastructure leaders in all the infrastructure policy challenges that are faced not only by the United States, but by countries around the world, which I think we're all pretty familiar with. So I'm very happy to chat about CPIP and what we're doing. If you give me your business card after this meeting, I'll be happy to add you to our mailing list and tell you about our efforts. And I do want to, try to make the number one, at least academic effort around the country in this infrastructure policy area. So what I'll do is introduce the speakers, just briefly talk about a few of the policy topics that we might want to focus on, although I want the discussion to be broad-ranging. And then here, we decided in a call about 7.5 minutes each from each speaker, so very brief remarks from each speaker. And then I would like you all to be thinking about questions that you might have for our group and issues you want to raise. So I'll just go right down the line. Doug Holtz-Eakin, who we did have up to speak and filled an auditorium at Cornell not too long ago with an excellent speech, has a distinguished record as an academic policy advisor and strategist. Currently, he's president of the American Action Forum and recently served as a commissioner on the congressionally created and chartered Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission. Since 2001, he's served in a variety of important positions, In 2001 to 2002, he was chief economist on the President's Council of Economic Advisors. He was also sixth director of the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office from 2003 to 2005. During 2007 and 2008, he was director of domestic and economic policy for the John McCain presidential campaign. Next is Shoshana Liu from U.S. Department of Transportation, where she is Chief Financial Officer and Assistant Secretary for Budget and Programs. At USDOT, she leads teams responsible for providing sound budget development, disciplined performance review, rigorous financial management, and responsible credit administration for the department. She was previously serving as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy at USDOT. She's had a number of roles, such as serving as Senior Policy Director for Energy and Climate Change at the White House Domestic Policy Council, and she received her master's degree in American History from Northwestern and undergraduate from Harvard. Our next is an old friend, Rob Atkinson, who is founder and president of the Information Technology and Innovation Forum, or ITIF, and he's one of the country's foremost thinkers on innovation economics. He has an extensive background in technology policy. He's conducted groundbreaking research projects on technology and innovation and is a valued advisor to state and national policymakers, and also a speaker on innovation policy nationally and internationally. Prior to founding ITIF, Rob was vice president of the Progressive Policy Institute and director of its technology and energy and new economy project. Last but not least is Tyler Duvall, who I've known for many years now. Met him serving on the National Surface Transportation Policy and Revenue Study Commission, wow, almost 10 years ago at USDOT. And I learned a ton of stuff about this from Tyler. He was my mentor early on, teaching about public-private partnerships and road pricing. But Tyler is now a principal with McKinsey & Company based out of its Washington, D.C. office, where he leads McKinsey's work with public sector infrastructure agencies and investors in infrastructure assets. He has also worked extensively in developing strategies for nonprofits. Prior to his time at McKinsey, he was both the Undersecretary Acting and Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy at the U.S. Department of Transportation. Following his nomination by the President and confirmation by the Senate in 2006, prior to that. So before joining the U.S. Department of Transportation, Tyler worked for Hogan & Hartson, LLP, which is now Hogan Lovells, as a business and finance lawyer focused on mergers and acquisitions. He holds a JD from the University of Virginia Law School and a BA in economics from Washington and Lee University. So I think I have given all the introductions. We did spend a little bit of time chatting about what to discuss in this, and we decided that it was very difficult to narrow the discussion. There's so many policy issues here. One of the things that kept popping up, however, was project delivery, problems associated with project delivery in the United States, in particular time overruns, cost overruns. I remember when I served on this commission where I met Tyler, one of the rules of thumb that came up is if a state governor, for example, or any state accepted $1 of federal funding for a project, it added approximately 11 years to the project delivery time. So clearly the permitting, et cetera, slowed everything down. Project delivery is a main issue, I think. Another one that I would like to focus on, or at least a distinction that is something important, I think, is the distinction between the funding of infrastructure projects. So I'm assuming the audience is familiar with, say, the American Society of Civil Engineers quadrennial grades of U.S. infrastructure. For example, the 2013 ASCE infrastructure report card assigned U.S. infrastructure a grade of D+ overall, roads a D, schools a D, dams a D, levees a D-. In fact, this is inspiring us at Cornell to ask the administration to give us a new grade, which is the F+ grade, which I think we need for students, right? I failed the course, but with a little extra twist. So we're familiar with the dilapidated, nature of U.S. infrastructure. But one of the things that I think gets lost in the debate is the funding of the infrastructure. In other words, the underlying dollars that you need to pay for the renovation coming either from broad-based taxes or from user fees versus the funding of that infrastructure. Once you have versus the financing. So public-private partnerships is an issue we can bring up. often mentioned as sort of I think a funding solution, but really is a financing solution. So I think it's useful in our discussion to separate those two things, and happy to talk about innovative finance a little bit more. Doug will focus a little bit on the context of the current infrastructure debate within the context of the nation's current fiscal situation and budgetary situation as well. Obviously, another big issue is just emerging technologies with regard to driverless cars, vehicle-to-vehicle communications are a big issue. There's innovations in concrete. There's innovations now in sensors that can be implanted in concrete that read out the conditions within it. A whole bunch of amazing things going on at this time. One of the things I'll just mention is today AEI is also releasing a policy brief that I did with a former student called on PPP units, which is available here at the table. Carter Cassaday is the former student who is now at Stanford getting his master's degree in construction management. But this is just an idea to help promote the use of public-private partnerships in the United States. If people don't know what PPP units are, they are an interesting entity within government that is designed to assist government in the better delivery of public-private partnerships. So think of like a little consulting firm, basically made up of experts, a dedicated specialized unit that helps the public sector to understand and do public-private partnerships more effectively. The World Bank has been publishing a lot of stuff about PPP units around the world. Egypt has developed these, Japan has them, Australia, Canada, and so on. And our proposal is basically to develop PPP units, not necessarily at the state level in the United States, because that would mean that you'd have 50 PPP units, plus one for DC, plus one for Puerto Rico, which we think might be a little bit too many, but to start off with perhaps regional PPP units. In other words, a unit that would cross state lines and would involve emerging mega regions. So I'll just point out that the policy brief is available outside at the table here. I'm happy to talk to you a little bit more about that. So that's our plan for helping to promote innovative finance and public-private partnerships and infrastructure delivery in the United States. But I'll stop there, and we'll just go right down the line here with brief remarks, and I'll start with Doug Holtz-Eakin. So Doug, you want to take it away?
Thank you. Thank you, Rick, for the invitation to be here tonight. Thank you for the opportunity to talk. Let me say things in about just basically three areas. One on the intersection of growth and the budget, a little bit on the productivity of infrastructure investments, and then some sort of what I think of as things to watch out for as we move forward in this issue. Infrastructure has gotten a lot of attention recently, in part because in a presidential campaign that's been relatively bereft of serious policy discussion, both candidates have had proposals on the infrastructure front. Hillary Clinton proposes to spend $250 billion in the traditional appropriations route over the next 5 years, plus $25 billion as seed money for an infrastructure bank. And Donald Trump has promised to do twice whatever she says. So the same level of detail he's provided for most of his proposals. And this reflects the relatively poor economic performance that both candidates have expressed concern about. And for those who aren't connoisseurs of this, the simple way to think about it is between the end of World War II and now, the U.S. economy grew rapidly enough that even with population growth, GDP per capita, roughly a metric of the standard of living, doubled on average every 35 years. So in one working career, the standard of living might double. It's your route to the American dream. At projected growth rates of 2% with population growth, it's going to double every 75 years. And so there's a lot of pressure to increase the growth rate of the economy. Infrastructure is viewed as one of the ways to do that, to sort of boost the better economic performance. That would also help the federal budget, which has some fairly daunting structural problems. People think of us having gotten rid of $1 trillion deficits relatively easily, and so in this town, they've stopped worrying about the deficit. What's left is a structural deficit, a fundamental mismatch between the money going out and the money coming in. That is going to grow to about $1 trillion, over 4% of GDP, on the next president's watch. So if left on autopilot, the budget deficit widens quite dramatically, and it gets worse thereafter. So the next 8 years are the good times. So you have these fundamental problems with growth and the budget, and inside the budget, the nasty secret is that for years now, the growth in the large entitlement spending programs, the Medicares, Medicaids, Social Securities of the world, have steadily pushed out of the budget the resources for non-defense domestic investment in areas like infrastructure, education, basic research, the places where you might genuinely invest in a more rapidly growing economy. So we have a top-line mismatch, we have a compositional mismatch, and it's occurring in a slow growth economy. Infrastructure lands as the solution to these problems if you can just figure out where you're going to get the money. And that gets you back to the issues that Rick raised. And so it's at that intersection. Now, the caveat I would say to all of this is that there are a lot of fairly fanciful numbers out there on the productivity impacts of dropping $1 of public infrastructure spending. I did a lot of work on this in the mid-'80s. We're starting to see the same kind of numbers come out again, which suggests you can just pay. It pays for itself. We shouldn't worry about spending the money. We'll get it all back. I think those are much too high. A modal estimate that I put together in a paper I wrote with Michael Mandel suggests that if you spend, $100 billion, you're going to add $5.4 billion to GDP. That's hardly going to pay for itself. It's beneficial. It adds a little bit under a 0.05 percentage points to the GDP growth rate. Every little 0.05 counts in this business, and I think it's worth thinking hard about that. And you might be able to get that to be bigger by having better project selection, more rapid time to completion, all things we're going to talk about next. But the biggest mistakes that are made in this area are to promise that it will happen fast. It doesn't, as Rick mentioned, and to say that you're going to have these huge impacts. And so we're seeing that again. I would expect this to be on the political agenda in the spring of 2017, and I'd just watch out for those kinds of overstatements. And then some things to just look for in terms of the debate going forward. First is how large of a program is going to be feasible to undertake. If you go back to the famous reports by the civil engineers, the infrastructure deficit's $3.6 trillion. So the 275 that Hillary Clinton's proposing, or even the 550 that Donald Trump is, doesn't look too big compared to that. So there's going to be a question of just how big a program can the political process put forward. Mm-hmm. Second thing to really pay attention to is what is infrastructure? There are some very elastic definitions of infrastructure out there. And so the things that I think of, transportation infrastructure, yes. Mm-hmm. Power, energy infrastructure, mm-hmm. Communications, broadband by modern definitions is a sensible thing to think about as infrastructure. Pre-kindergarten education, I don't think of as infrastructure. A lot of people think we should be investing in that. That's where the money should go. Healthcare, people are healthier, they're better off. That's infrastructure. So if you've got a relatively limited amount of funds and you start investing in everything under the sun, pretty soon you're not going to get much out of it in terms of the desirable outcomes that everyone thinks about. So I'd keep a very close eye on that. And I worry about how fast it gets spent. Spending it fast is a recipe for disaster. And then the last piece to look for is what's the strategy? What will be the vision for what's the federal role? In my view, that should be focused on national connectivity. That's an appropriate federal role. Everything else should go to the states and regions to think about the legacy infrastructure and getting it up to snuff. And along with that, what are the complementary reforms that might come with the money? If it's just money, we still have 11 years every time the governor touches that money. What reforms can you get along with it that will allow us to get better returns, change the modal estimate to something that might be twice as high as what the historical data would suggest? And those are the things that I think we'd benefit from. So I think this is a great time to have this discussion, and I am privileged to be on this panel, I think largely from a clerical error, but these guys are real experts, and I look forward to their comments.
Thanks, and those last two comments are actually a very good transition to the issues I was going to talk about a bit this evening. The first point that I wanted to touch on is to talk a little bit about the difference between funding and financing and sort of thinking about how the federal role fits into that construct. I think the administration has spent a great deal of time and effort over the past years sort of talking about the magnitude of our collective infrastructure deficit and the sort of different ways that we can coalesce around fixing it. Recently, we saw what is the first surface transportation package that kind of extends for a multi-year period and over a decade. And it's an important down payment in providing stable funding over the next 5-year period. What it is not is a solution to the kind of overall magnitude of the problem. I mean, to give you a sense of the sort of difference in orders of magnitude of what we're talking about, the Fixing American Surface Transportation, or FAST Act, is a $300 billion plus package. But when you kind of factor in that and the discretionary side spending at the Transportation Department, you're looking at, and this is sort of solely in the transportation space, kind of combining the different modes of transportation that we deal with, roughly $76 billion a year. If you look at how that compares with what is proposed in the President's budget, which sort of incorporates what we would like to see in our transportation infrastructure policy, it's more like $98 billion. That's a pretty significant gap. And when you think about what that means in terms of impact, not in the macroeconomic sense, but in terms of what it delivers, I think the example of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act is sort of a good metric for being able to kind of look at what expanding the investment in the system by tens of billions, hundreds of billions, depending on which piece you're looking at, into the system kind of plays out in terms of impact. I mean, of the roughly $48 billion that was invested in the transportation infrastructure segment of that specifically, I mean, we saw very concrete impacts come out of that. I mean, you're talking about 42,000 miles of road, 2,700 bridges. I mean, these are the sorts of things that you get for these dollars, and there is sort of no quick fix, as you were saying, to kind of getting what you pay for in that regard. And I think touching on our example just a bit, part of the kind of challenge of dealing with this is that the limitations of the shovel-ready project are quite substantial. I mean, you can fill potholes. There are some of these investments that can be made quickly, and that's sort of largely dealing with the kind of backlog of repairs that's needed. But when you get to kind of looking at visionary projects that sort of transform the way the landscape looks and the way people move across the nation, those are projects that take years. And it takes years in planning, and it means that the spend down time frame that you're looking for in these projects is different. So there's kind of a long-term planning need that is sort of inherent in the way that these projects play out, and that very much plays out in terms of the investment picture as well. I think when you look at what we're solving for, our department did sort of a needs assessment over the next 30 years called Beyond Traffic to kind of start to quantify what it is that we're up against, not just in dealing with the backlog, but in looking at the trends that we'll need to deal with moving forward. And it looks at population growth. We're expected to grow by 70 million by 2045. Looks at the changing geography of the landscape and where people are increasingly moving and living. And one of the trends that we saw in this report is that by 2050, emerging megaregions could encompass roughly 3/4 of the U.S. population. And I think that touches on one of the points that your paper brings up, which is that it kind of triggers us to need to think a little bit differently about how we plan and govern at a regional scale, and kind of rethinking some of our investment strategies so that it's not just on the state-by-state model, but looking at kind of regional needs and regional governments around projects. And I think all of this obviously puts pressure on the movement of freight. Freight is expected to increase by 45% by 2045, so that just adds to the stresses on the system and the need to sort of think long-term in terms of how we pay for it. So I think all of this is by way of saying that the conversation about PPPs and about innovative finance is part of a very important bigger picture conversation, and part of a context where it's about thinking about what strong government investment looks like and how you sort of pair that with leveraging additional dollars from the private sector. I think one sort of piece on the governance side, and this ties into your notion about the PPP units, is that among the changes that the FAST Act authorization provided were to really put into effect some authorities that enable the Transportation Department to think differently about the way it facilitates private investment and sort of coalesces the resources of the department in that vein. One of the most significant policy changes from our perspective in our most recent authorization was a provision that enabled us to set up a new Surface Transportation Bureau, which we are calling the Build America Bureau, and which we have actually recently broke ground on, so to speak. It is now up and running. We have actually combined authorities that existed in a disparate fashion in our department for many years, and we're really learning as we go in terms of a different model of governing to facilitate easier access for public and private partners. What that means in practice is that we took a number of loan programs that had sort of previously existed separately, joined them together in a single entity, and kind of paired that with a function that is separate but within the same organization that provides technical assistance, so that as you as a project sponsor are looking to engage with the federal process, including the various permitting processes that are requisite to using federal dollars, that there's a sort of single window that you can interface with in order to kind of work with the different federal programs. I think that ties into some broader work that the administration has really focused on over the past several years now, which is focused on how you kind of take a constellation of permitting and approval processes at the government level and make them work in a more streamlined fashion while preserving the equities that they're designed to protect. I think we found that there are many reasons why these processes are sort of naturally challenging, and there are instances where a project takes a great deal of time because it's a complicated project. I mean, if you look at where the sort of longest reviews are, it is often projects that have a significant impact on a community or landscape, and where there's a real reason why the planning takes longer than with a more sort of simple bridge reconstruction. At the same time, we had found that there were a lot of areas where there was sort of common sense logic that was not in place. Multiple processes where what my boss likes to call it a relay race. You would go from one approval to another rather than kind of looking at how you do all of these at the same time in the same document with the same resources. And I think what we have found, and which the FAST Act authorization actually codified for us, is that measures to do things like increasing public transparency go a long way. We have tested and I think proven the value of a public infrastructure dashboard that provides some sunlight around what is kind of occupying the time as a project goes through the approval processes. And we have found that when you sort of commit different agencies to a schedule and make it available to the public where a project is, it has an expediting effect. And so that sort of thing, I think we are now working, thanks to administrative actions that have been taken earlier and then were expanded upon in our authorization, to really turn that into the common process, so that you take an innovation that worked with a project like the Tappan Zee Bridge in New York and make that the standard practice rather than just the best practice. So I think with that, I will turn it over to the next speaker.
Okay. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Rick. I've enjoyed working together over the decade or so on these pretty important questions. So I lead a think tank on technology, although actually Tyler shanghaied me years ago when he was in the Bush administration to end up being on and then being chair of this congressionally chartered Surface Transportation Infrastructure Finance Commission. So I really thought about those questions a lot. So I want to mostly talk about technology, but just can't resist a few opening comments. I'm going to sort of channel Donald Trump here for a moment and say our surface transportation system is a disaster. It's just a disaster, and I don't think people understand it. It's a little bit like the frog in the boiling water. It just gets worse every year, and we sort of acclimate to it. I'll tell you, when I was going to work this morning, man, the traffic was awful. As I was riding down the bike path, looking at those poor cars stuck in traffic, I was just like, oh my God, how do people live that way? I'm being a little flip, but seriously, you look at the Texas Transportation Institute studies, and every year congestion gets worse, and we seem to live with it. Why is that? Largely because we have decided as a country we don't want to solve the problem. That's it. So on the left, we have what you could call the congestion caucus, which looks at congestion as a social policy good. If we, literally, I remember a guy riding to work one day, and we were chatting, and he leads one of these groups here in Washington, and I was complaining about something or other, and he's like, well, no, the whole purpose of congestion is to get people to start riding their bikes. And I'm sorry, I love riding my bike. Tyler knows that most Americans aren't going to ride their bike to work, okay? And so you can make life hell for them, and all you will have accomplished is you've made life hell for them. That's all you're going to accomplish. Same thing with the delay caucus, not Tom DeLay, but the delay caucus. There are groups out there whose intentional purpose is to delay projects as long as possible. On the right, given that I'm here at AEI, you have a whole lot of people who just simply do not want to raise the gas tax. And even though I'm the biggest supporter, and Tyler can vouch for the biggest supporter for tolling and pricing, the bridge that you got to get there, because it's going to take a while to get there, is you got to do something on the gas tax. And that's why I think we have the problem. I agreed with almost everything Doug said. I don't think this is a budget problem, because the last thing in the world I want, and the thing I hate more than anything, is paying for this stuff out of general funds. I think it's a terrible idea. It should be paid for by user fees, whether it's an indirect user fee like a gas tax, or even better, a direct user fee like a toll. So I don't think it's a budget issue if you did it right. Congress would just raise the gas tax or reform all these laws and provide incentives to do tolling. With regard to productivity, I agree with Doug there 100%. I think the productivity benefits of this are significantly overrated. It's not that you're not going to get them, you will. I wrote an op-ed for a column I had with Christian Science Monitor a couple weeks ago, and I was looking at sort of what would be the best infrastructure investments, and Larry Summers literally proposed that we should fill potholes. Okay, that's the lowest productivity benefit you can get, okay? Filling potholes is like, I don't want to say zero, but it's not very much. Adding capacity, building more lanes, building more roads, that gets you a certain amount, at less than it did 50 years ago when we had no system, but it gets you something. But, and I don't have pure concrete evidence of this, but I was able to pull together a number of different studies. If instead you spent the money on making our transportation system smart by using technology, the productivity bang for the dollar buck is a lot bigger. So for example, according to GAO, if you were to invest, if the single best cost-benefit analysis we could do in the cost-benefit project in the US we could do by far would be to digitize traffic lights, make traffic lights smart. So in other words, how many times you sat at a traffic light and it's red and there's no cars going the other way and there's a boatload of cars sitting there? That's a fixable problem. Easily fixable, just a question of upgrading our system to make it smart into the 21st century. We don't do it, partly because state DOTs and, I have to say increasingly, federal DOT is coming around to smart, so I'll say that. It's a slow process. But state DOTs largely think concrete. We wrote a recent report called From Concrete to Chips saying you got to get out of the concrete business. All right, so what I really want to talk about is technology, and that's the segue. Why do we have the system we have? Essentially government run, and the notion that what the government role is to build something, and then if it works, who knows, who cares? We don't, it's not our job. In other words, we don't have systems where people are managing performance. We have systems where people build stuff. We don't have anybody in charge of managing performance. And secondly, we have very little private provision of infrastructure. You know, you can go out to the Dulles Greenway, to Leesburg, a nice project. You can do that in Denver, but very little privately owned roads. Okay, why are both of those things true? Largely, you have to go back and look at what Ronald Coase talked about with transaction costs. When transaction costs are super high, you kind of do it through top-down bureaucracy and government ownership. When transaction costs are super low, you can enable market forces. The good thing I think about today where we are is we're on the cusp of a revolution where transaction costs can go close to zero for much of this stuff. Let me give you an example. This thing here, there's a little group in Boston, I forget the name of it, Urban Factory, Innovation Factory, or something that the mayor created, and they worked with their public works department. And you can download this you can download it here, I suppose, but if it doesn't work, if you're in Boston, you can download it for your iOS or Android device, and it's called Street Bump. And when you put your phone in your car driving, every time your car goes over a bump, it sends a signal, anonymized, doesn't know who went over the bump, it just says, hey, car went over a bump. It turns out they're getting millions and millions of hits a day in Boston, and they've reduced the time between fixing a pothole from like 3 weeks to 1 day or 2 days. But it's provided a whole level of insight onto the actual performance, conditions of the roads. Now there's absolutely no reason within 2 weeks that every city in the US could have this on everybody's phone. It's code, it's there. You just change the GIS coordinates. Why aren't we doing that? People don't know about it. This is my complaint about DOT. I've argued with the White House. This is something the White House and DOT ought to do. Throw this software up in the cloud, encourage everybody to do it. If you want federal money, you got to put this up there, and people can do this. So that would be an amazing thing right away. I mean, one of the things the Boston people learned is where they need to salt the roads, because they've also designed if the car fishtails, the phone moves this way instead of that way. And now they know in real time where they need to salt the roads, where they need to plow the roads better. So you can move now from kind of just a build it and walk away to a performance-based system. You can also move to a performance-based system not just for conditions, but for performance. So you look at, for example, things like Waze, Google Maps. We have the ability now to really know in real time the performance of almost every road in the country. Why don't we use that to hold people accountable? We know where the roads are that are bad. Why aren't we holding people, DOTs and other people accountable for improving performance? Another thing that you could do would be in terms of payments. So right now, it's really hard to do a toll road because you got to set up a toll, and you got to. I was on the whatever the thing up here in the Beltway, you know, the intercounty connector or whatever.
The hot lane? Or you on,
Pardon?
You were on the Beltway? Or
No, the one, the
ICC?
cross one off of 270.
Yeah,
but I couldn't go on it because I didn't have the stupid transponder. And I don't drive enough, you know. My bike doesn't need a transponder, and so. But the point is, with what's called the VMT system, Vehicle Miles Traveled System, and this technology could work right now today if we wanted it. Basically, if you go and you try to buy a new car, they're like buying a computer on wheels. They're incredibly electronic. With a little tweak, you could require every OEM, every car manufacturer to put a little, basically a little device in there that will allow the car to pay by the time of day and the road it's on. So how does that work? There's, by the way, clear, important, really important, one-way GPS signal, okay, not two-way. So the way VMT works is the car knows where it is, but the man does not know where you are. Okay, so it's really important to remember. A lot of people talk about this tracking. No. All it is you know two things for this system to work. You know where your car is. You have a little lookup table on your little computer in this onboard device that tells you the road you're on and what the price of that road is. So if you're driving on the Beltway at 9 in the morning, you're going to pay a lot of money. If you're driving on a rural road in the middle at 2 a.m., you're not going to pay very much money at all. So with this technology, which by the way is super easy to do, everybody could have it, very low cost, you could move to essentially pay by the mile, pay by the road. The advantage of that is you now start to really bring in market forces. Congestion pricing, you can charge trucks that are really heavy, a lot more money than they're paying now when they do damage on the road. And the really important thing about that is it really then opens up private road provision. Why don't private roads work? Because everybody complains about you pay twice on a private road. You're paying your gas tax and you're paying your toll. If you move to a VMT, you're only paying one fee. And that really levels the playing field with private provisioning of roads. So bottom line is, I think the most important thing, and by the way, the whole notion of having an infrastructure bank will never work unless, a bank is normally premised on this thing of actually making money. So you don't give people money. Banks don't give people money. They loan people money, and there's a repayment scheme. So as Tyler knows better than anybody else, financing systems are great, but you need a funding system. And that's the great thing about a VMT. It automatically creates this funding system so that PPP projects are a lot easier to go forward with. So I'll just close by saying, I think that's why the technology, thinking about advanced IT for the transportation system is so important, because it gives you better performance, it holds people accountable, and it really enables market forces to take hold. But it won't happen unless the government, the federal government in particular, makes a few sort of incentives and strategic changes to really move us in that direction.
Great, thanks, Rod. So you know, I think everything works fine, so I think we should just wrap up
We're done.
You know, so look, when I started in transportation in 2002, I'll never forget, I used to write speeches for then Secretary Norm Mineta in advance of the then reauthorization of T21, which nobody in this room probably even knows what that was. But that was a big landmark piece of federal legislation to try to reform, it had some fundamental reform elements, actually try to inspire metropolitan areas to do smarter planning. But the speech lines that were coming from our speechwriters, and this was, you know, beginning of the Bush administration, talking about domestic policy issues and things like that, was basically talking about building on the successes of T21 and how great everything was working. And we had this massive, actually, cash balance in the Federal Highway Trust Fund. We spend it down. The Treasury was rating it, you know, but let's get it. And I grew up down the street in Bethesda, born here in D.C., and it was just counter to every observation of my life. It was like, this thing is not working at all. Like, there's nothing about this thing that works. And so we started to think about it, and I just started to become convinced, talking to experts around the world, that the system was fundamentally broken, as Rob says. And so now I've kind of had a long career in government, and then left, and now I'm at McKinsey working with state and local governments around the world, federal governments, and investors in these broken systems. And we've kind of boiled it down that there's, at the project level, or frankly program level, there's three basic problems on the supply side, and then there's a big demand side problem. On the supply side, kind of what we build, which has already been noted, is beyond broken. People do not appreciate how undisciplined the current investment processes are on the public sector side. Now, on the flip side, you go into, BNSF Railroad or, one of the big MLPs that owns pipelines or, any big capital-intensive utility, the investment approach and processes looks quite radical and simple, which is what's the ROI on the investment. And they battle within the companies or enterprises for capital to invest in higher return projects and are then held accountable if those investments actually don't produce those returns. So if you're part of a unit that's pitching a big capital investment, you say, here's the ROI projection over the next 15 years, 2 years later, you're hauled back in front of the executives and when the investment is not playing out as expected and you're in deep trouble. That is pretty much the opposite of what we have on the public sector side. In fact, most public sector allocation processes start with a political division. So we're working for a couple I can't say who, but take state X. Initial allocation, 33% to this part of the state, 33 to that, and 33 to the other. Okay, let's start with that. Within that, let's do an immediate break of, let's do 75% for state of good repair, 25% for new capacity, as if these are like completely separate opportunities. We can never fix something that we widen, and we can never widen something that's broken. Anyway, so basically that allocation method in the United States is completely broken, right? Now it's getting better, I will say. I mean, the GAO did some work in looking at this. I actually think the USDOT's done a really good job in administering some of the discretionary programs, at least asking some basic questions. We were slapped down by Congress as part of the New Starts program for trying to ask some basic, not cost-benefit, cost-effectiveness questions. Congress said, no, that's crazy, you shouldn't ask those questions. So there was, at the core, we have an allocation, a fundamental allocation problem that is the bridge to nowhere in some ways masqueraded it because it was such an egregious example that people didn't realize that if you look, there are 50 other projects that are not equally bad but don't make a lot of sense. And as a result, the technology investments that Rob talked about just get short shrift, right? If you really did a rack and stack on true ROI, either from an internal or social perspective, these investments that he just referred to would immediately pop up. There'd be no-brainer investments because we have a huge network. People don't, I do a lot of work in India. We have more infrastructure in the United States than anybody in the world by a wide margin, right? Just look at, you take the metric and we've got more of it. So we got massive installed base. You got to be really smart to get high ROI when you have such a huge installed base. And of course, they should be targeting the metro areas, right? Because that's where all the demand constraints are, supply and demand constraints are. So anyway, that's part one, is we got to fix that. There are lots of different ways you can fix it. It's quite simple, but the political arena has got to absorb how you do that much better. Second is once we decide on that allocation, let's say we fixed it, we got a B+, it's better. The process to take that prioritization into action, as we've hit on, is really broken. Frankly, almost arguably more broken than the first bucket. And so that's, you could drop, we used to talk, in the government, you could drop $1 trillion tomorrow and say, let's go, I actually think Trump did say, let's invest $1 trillion. He's quadrupled, I guess. This was yesterday, he put $1 trillion out there. You could do that, the effects, one, the allocation issue, but the effects in the real system would not be felt for a very long time, and then the effects would be so muted that you basically question a lot of the projects that would get funded under that. And it's not just environmental. I think the environmental process is scapegoated to a large extent. It's the upfront planning process. Procurement is really broken. So we do a lot of work in McKinsey on procurement of projects, procuring engineering services, procuring construction, procuring everything else, the technology associated with these projects. It takes way too long. It's not a value-based procurement. When you run procurement at General Electric, for example, you are one of the smartest people in the company. You are basically, your job is to integrate the business objectives, obviously, while saving the company money with an efficient way to procure. Procurement in the public sector is really driven a lot by the rules and regulations, driven towards a low-bid, non-value-based procurement. And actually, the feds have tried, I think, in creative ways to encourage that. The P3 movement at some level is a way to escape that, an attempt by governments to escape that. But that is a major constraint. So that second part is a real problem. The third piece, which actually gets less attention, but it's something that we at McKinsey, we have a think tank called the McKinsey Global Institute that does a lot of work on labor productivity, the construction sector. So let's say we get it right, then we actually go build it, or we say, the sequence to let's go, shovels in the ground. The construction productivity in the United States labor side is flat. It's been flat for like 25 years, public and private. But public is where, and we're actually doing some additional, we should talk, Doug, about whether you could help us with this. We're doing some additional research on the why. It's not exactly clear why the public sector procurement processes are not driving, labor productivity. But the truth is, again, if you imagine the way an owner engages, so take a big auto company or big refinery, the way they engage, or Toyota, frankly, Toyota pioneered this, the way they engage in the construction processes of their own investments is significantly different and more robust than what you see in the government. So typically in the public sector transportation space, they let a construction contract, after all the stuff we just talked about, the oversight around that is really what you call, it's a waste, fraud, and abuse type oversight, but not around efficiency and productivity and delivery of the project. So they don't engage on the construction methods that are being used because, frankly, there's not a lot of expertise. That's their risk, not ours. But the result is a really inefficient process. So projects cost significantly more in the United States than they do in comparable countries because of that problem. So if you take that end to end, you've got the next 25 years of work. Thankfully for management consultants, that's a good thing. For the country, it's a bad thing. But that's got to get fixed. And then last thing I'll say, and we can open up to questions, I think the demand side problem that Rob hit on is still not gotten enough attention. So when I was in the government, I worked with a lot of people on this panel and then around the world, basically, to try to instill more pricing discipline associated with, frankly, user fees. I don't think there's a scenario you're going to solve the urban congestion problem in the United States. Obviously, I think that the autonomous vehicle is also an attempt to end run that problem ultimately, unless you start to balance supply and demand. And unless you have a price mechanism, I don't see how you can balance supply and demand in urban areas. It's just too scarce and important a resource that has way too much demand. And finally, at least in the United States, we have some experiments that have proven this out. Obviously, there are now something like 20 jurisdictions that have hot lane projects like we have here on the Capitol Beltway in the works. There are, I think, a number of 15 metropolitan areas have them that are actually open. Public support is in the 85% range, quite popular. So this is an area where the demand and user experience is far ahead of where the political class seems to be in terms of understanding how this could be a game changer. And I think what we used to argue is there's this win-win-win associated with the efficiency of the asset. The price signal then as to where we need to add more supply, so there's no big mystery anymore on that first point. So there's this great little marriage between the demand and supply. And then ultimately you can spill off other revenues to then reinvest itself. So that triple win is for some reason not absorbed right now in the discussion as much as it should. So we can pause and then we should, obviously, I don't know how you want to run the next of, yeah.
So I'm not sure either.
Yeah.
But one thing I did want to see if there's sort of a consensus. I almost have to do this on behalf of one of my intellectual heroes, who is Cliff Winston, who sits 2 doors down, but is in China, I happen to know right now, because I've been teaching his work for 15 or 20 years in this space, which is tremendous. And I think if Cliff, here's some of Cliff's work published not too long ago in the Journal of Regulatory Economics, studied the rate of return on marginal investment in the current system. And it's kind of interesting from the view of an economist because it's a textbook case of diminishing marginal returns. And say the interstate highways in the 70s, additional investment was huge, 80s a little less, 90s a little less. Now it's in the single digits. But one of the things that Cliff emphasizes, of course, is that's under the current system of delivery that you talked about, Tyler. So it seems sort of intuitive, and Shoshana's point as well, if we direct the investment in the right place, that the rates of return could be very high. So, for example, added lanes on very congested roads would bring a lot more value than another lane on a rural interstate, for example. And I wonder if everybody would sort of have, so to your point, Doug, if we sort of have consensus that Cliff is right in some sense. The returns are low under the current system, but if the investment can be properly directed through some mechanism on maybe the supply side, right, improving the supply side delivery, the social returns would be pretty high, which is one of the points I've always made about the importance of private sector participation in all this, is it can help to direct the investment a little bit better, and we would get those high rates of return. Does that seem reasonable to Rob?
But I guess to Tyler's point, it's 3 issues. It's project selection, it's project delivery, and it's project construction. And all 3 are suboptimal. And if we focused on all 3, then yeah, ROIs would go up. One thing, by the way, people don't talk about, and that's really R&D on materials. I mean, there's really interesting R&D on materials. We waste a lot of money on paving something and then 10 years later repaving it. We don't really invest enough in better materials. Construction's interesting. We just wrote a big report on productivity and why was it so low in the U.S. And had a case study on construction, which some would argue measured productivity is negative, but there was a very good study by the National Academy of Sciences, and it looked at, is this because they've sort of adopted all the technology, you can only get so many steamrollers, or is it something else? And it appears to be something else. There does appear to be a suite of technologies that could be adopted in construction that simply the industry doesn't adopt, partly because it's all these low bid contracts with these, mom and pop little asphalt companies that can't get the scale, they can't risk investing in CapEx in a bigger thing. And so sort of that goes back into how we buy projects. Could we start enabling bigger companies that have scale? I mean, we don't buy our cars from Fred and Sally's car company. We buy them from Ford or Toyota, who have scale and can invest in R&D and productivity.
Yeah. One thing I would mention, and then maybe we'll go to Q&A, Rob, is you brought up the gas tax. And one of the things on the commission, you and I were on sister commissions, as it was on our commission, was the federal versus the state gas taxes. And of course, the states actually own, physically, literally, legally own the interstate system. They have title to the highways, so the problem of operation and maintenance of the interstates falls to the governor of a state, typically. So the question would be, and this gets to funding, right? So we all know that the revenue from fossil fuel taxes are declining as people shift more into electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles. Hydrogen fuel cell vehicles is another possibility. The gas tax is not indexed to inflation, so even with modest inflation rates, it's declined. The purchasing power has declined by over a third since the gas tax was last raised at the federal level, which was in 1993. Right, to the current 18.4 cents. So one question, that I think is interesting was from our commission, that generates is the federal role. In other words, now that the interstate highway system is largely built, what's the federal role vis-a-vis the states? Should the federal gas tax, be increased, or should we let the governors kind of work out that, or who the relevant bodies are, the funding piece of this, with I think Virginia raising a dedicated state sales tax, right? So when you made your comment about the gas tax, I said yes, but is it a federal or state
Yeah, so I
issue?
have kind of a different view on that, which nobody likes.
I want to attack.
That's
Sorry.
Me too.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, we're kidding.
So just
I'm going to attack you no matter what.
I
No matter what you say, I'm going to attack you. Go ahead.
Okay, good. I think we should make the gas tax $100 a gallon. So I think what we should do is what I think we should do is we should have a 10-year window where we raise the gas tax a certain amount, like 10 cents a gallon. So we get a lot of money, but then we use that money to incent the transition in states to a price-based system. States will not move. It's a long, long time before the governors have the political will to embrace pricing, because the initial reaction of citizenry is they don't like it. Once they experience it, they like it. But governors, so let's have the federal government use that money and basically say, you want to build something, we're going to give you 80% of the money, but it's got to be tolled. To do that, number two, start really investing some of that money into this technology system, and number three, start putting a mandate for OEM cars to have these devices on it and give people a choice they want to. And then after that transition, then a lot can go back to the states, because they'll have an infrastructure to price things, they'll have an experience to price things, but just sort of saying, well, they're going to use the current system, I think it's just going to be suboptimal unless we can transform the system, and the feds could use incentives to do that.
So the thing I was going to say is, first, I just want to echo.
Do you disagree with that?
I'll tell you where the observations I'd make in this. So first of all, one of the things I would love to see come out of this sort of next round is a clear statement of the federal government's role. What is it trying to accomplish? Not just be the money bags and hand it out in different arbitrary formulas, but what's it trying to accomplish? And to me, that should be national connectivity in a mode-neutral fashion. Go. And look at the outcomes that you get, measure them well, throughput in the freight system, things like that, and that should be the goal. I don't know if we'll have that kind of discussion, but that would be helpful. The thing I was going to say about your comments on the budget, how this is not a budget issue and the gas tax is related, is that's because you are a very disciplined person living in a very well-defined world, which is transportation infrastructure and financing it with some sort of direct or indirect user fee. I was trying to warn you with my opening remarks, that may not be the world we end up in a couple of months, and with other things you end up with general revenue much more easily. And some of the candidates, for example, Clinton has openly said, well, I'm going to pay for this with $275 billion in business tax reform. So they've already opened that door. Right. So if that door is open, let's be cognizant of it and try to make sure that we get resources that are adequate and are well targeted. Last thing I'd say about the gas tax. The demise of the gas tax had one benefit, and it's a political benefit. When there was no general revenue transfer, and it's now about a quarter of the highway trust fund spending is going in there, all the states fought to get their gas tax back, which produced really stupid outcomes, right? I mean, you're definitely not getting the right stuff. Once that link got broke, the politics actually got better because they weren't fighting to get their gas tax back. And I think we have to avoid recreating that political fight at the state level because it wasn't getting you good performance out of the system.
So one of the ground rules that we agreed on in our call was not to put Shoshana too much on the spot because she's part of the administration. Let's throw that out the window. No, but Shoshana, I don't know, this is federal
So
state.
what do you think of Donald Trump?
To the degree you're comfortable
Since
commenting
progress
on
business tax reform was our proposal.
that. Right, there we go.
No, I mean, I think the administration introduced that idea several years ago now, in part to try and kind of marry up the macroeconomic conversation. And, you know, in a universe where the purchasing power of the gas tax is declining in part because of improvements by the policies we've implemented, such as the fuel economy regulations. I mean, the better the cars perform, the less we buy with the gas tax. So it kind of, you know, I think pushes a broader conversation about how the different economic components of it are coming together. And I think that was the context in which we introduced the idea of coupling business tax reform with infrastructure investment. And it actually got a fair amount of traction in the debate. I mean, it didn't obviously ultimately happen in the passage of the FAST Act, and the pay for, I would say, is a, you know, more
creative,
abstract exercise in government accounting. But, you know, it did have a sort of serious showing, and, you know, it got, I think, farther than many thought it would.
Okay.
You know, we supplemented it in this year's budget with sort of introducing the notion of a per barrel oil fee, trying again to kind of get at the idea that you look at the fees a little bit differently in the production cycle, and again, you know, not tying it directly to driving as we know it, but sort of thinking about, you know, petroleum use broadly in the sort of course of the macro conversation. Right. So, you know, I think that we have made progress in terms of, you know, spurring that debate, which obviously has, you know, different twists and turns, and, you know, will take on a long-term shape. I mean, I think one point that I also just wanted to add on to the kind of points that you sort of stipulated as, you know, notions that we agreed on is that I would sort of add the idea of long-term planning and long-term cost-benefit analysis into that matrix.
Absolutely.
Because I think part of what any of these ideas demand is to sort of broaden the, you know, public attention span to look at these in terms of life cycle costs. And, you know, it's a hard policy measure to correct against, and it's a, you know, sort of counterintuitive way to approach an idea. But I think that you know, is actually a place where the conversation about public-private partnerships, you know, can have tremendous leverage, because part of what, you know, entering into these transactions forces is thinking about what the project costs gains and the upkeep costs gains over the kind of 30, 40, 50-year time frame. I think one more sort of public policy piece that I would add into that long-term, you know, planning, you know, notion, and the sort of question about where the federal government is or is not in that regard is, I think some of the regulatory actions that have been a bit more under the radar than, you know, some of the kind of big ones that everybody knows about are a set of regs that we are in the process of developing that pertain to asset management. There's a piece going on in the transit space and a piece going on in the highway space, and part of what that is about is forcing a, you know, long-term accounting framework for the recipients of public dollars. You know, I think it is in, you know, the initial phase of execution now, and it is a bit in the sort of traditional, you know, highway pay for mode. But I think to kind of, you know, get at that question of what does it cost to keep up an asset over the life cycle is an important question to instill into the kind of AASHTO conversation in this space. So I would point to that as a place alongside some of the performance measure regulations that we're in the course of developing, as sort of a space where that conversation that you were talking about, Rob, could ensue.
So I would just add a footnote to what you said, because it's one of my shticks, you know, is one of the great unsung benefits of public-private partnerships, I think, actually, too, are life cycle asset costing, where it's costed into the bid over the life of the contract, and life cycle asset maintenance, in the sense that you can contractually require the private sector partner to maintain the asset according to a certain engineering standard under very clear and strict contractual penalties. So the big problem, and, you know, one of the big problems in the U.S. amongst many, is that we're great at building shiny new stuff, but we're really terrible at taking care of what we've built. And so I think, you know, a PPP asset maintenance contract, maybe just operation maintenance separately, could be could be very, very valuable. And I understand other countries have done a lot, like Japan, for example.
But our regulations actually will now require that to be done for all of the recipients of federal aid funding. So, the ones that are done under traditional procurement also will have to enter into that longer term fund exercise. So, it doesn't necessarily get as far as it would in a situation where they're doing the PPP.
Right, but you're heading in that.
But yeah, you are heading in a broader version of that direction.
Very good. So I have a ton of other questions generated by this, but I don't want to be greedy. So Miss in the scarf there.
Yeah, putting aside for whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, Secretary Clinton's campaign has indicated that an infrastructure bank, together with infrastructure grants, would be part of her first 100 days. How would you all, given that, how would you envision that would be set up? Would it be an quasi-independent like Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, or would it be like FDIC? Would there be public shares? I mean, what sort of things have you all heard discussed about how this would actually be implemented? Would it be a public-private where there be shares like Fannie Mae? Just sort of how this might work, since apparently, as I said, Secretary Clinton's campaign considers it a major part of their first few major initiatives in office.
Yeah, so I haven't seen kind of what she's talked about. I mean, obviously the administration has proposed a variety of kind of financing structures. Within transportation now, you already have it. I mean, people don't seem to understand that you've got the cheapest credit you're ever going to get in any arena in the world for long-term loans for service transportation projects. That
You mean TIFIA?
Yeah, I mean it's it's relatively undersubscribed, given these other constraints we have. So, and then on the rail side, you've got extremely cheap credit for rail infrastructure. So I think to say you need that, you're going to need to really focus on what are the other sectors that you think are kind of getting undercapitalized because the cost of finance, and I think that's the big question, is do we think we have a cost of finance problem or availability of capital problem that's not flowing in correctly? I mean, the freight railroad sector in the United States, I mean, Warren Buffett 2 years ago deemed it worthy of one of the largest investments he's ever done when he bought BNSF Railroad. The pipeline sector has seen the biggest pension funds and private equity investors in the world pumping capital into there. Not big problems necessarily. The telecom network has seen overinvestment in various cases. So we don't really have a capital problem in a lot. Water and wastewater, yes. I think there are actually really material financing constraints on the water and wastewater side. And then, if you want to get into school and social infrastructure, I was speaking at a municipal finance conference the other day. Muni markets as cheap as it's ever been. I mean, I don't know what a 10-year muni is for a AAA rated, credit is what, 2, 3 or something. I mean, it's absurdly cheap, for these governments to borrow. So I think what would need to happen for anyone to say that's a really good idea, you need to use it to address some of these things we're talking about here, which is, are you using the cheap capital as a lever point to drive performance around the assets that we have and the expansion of the network where we need to expand? And I think too often I have a personal view that the lack of funding is actually more of a symptom than a cause. That all of these other failures, the public has really lost confidence, understandably, in pumping additional resources into these things. And until you address that, I mean, that's the basic Republican position. On Amtrak, for example, for many years was reform first, funding later. You're caught in this quagmire conversation between the parties now, where one's saying that and the other's saying spend. And I think somebody could figure out how to navigate through that wormhole. There's a really big solution for the country. I just don't know who can do that.
Sir, could you identify yourself?
Greetings. I'm Thomas Ward. I'm a former economist from the World Bank and a leader on P3s. And arguably around the globe, I've been challenging the issue of P3s in the aspect of, one, P3s will never be more than maybe 20% of the total, even in Ukraine or in England, Canada, Australia, where it's been leading for a long time. But the biggest thing is how do we create an incentive for these things to work? Two things would come into play. One, with a long-term contract, you're getting the incentive that we have to address as one said up here already, the least cost model. Because least cost models are going to get cheapest stuff at the beginning, what won't last in the long term. when you have a long-term contract, you're putting in the back end, you have skin in the game, as I call it, to have an incentive to maybe be more expensive up front. And this is where the complaint is about P3s, is they tend to be more expensive up front because they're building better, because they're going to have to pay for the maintenance later on. And so there's thought about, building it better up front, so it is going to be cheaper. Furthermore, when it is a contract, now you have an incentive to make sure they're going to take care of it afterwards. Because let's be honest, when it's a government to government, there is no incentive on a contractual basis to even honor those contracts to maintain it. And we've seen it with the trust funds. It's the classical build it, they will come. And my major concern is coming up is there's a big push of infrastructure. But the question is, are we just going to build a lot of stuff and now it's going to be a big problem for the future generation, which is what we did already. And we're just repeating the problem.
Anybody want to comment on that?
I share your concerns. Have another glass.
One thing on the percentage, you're right. I think in overall spending, you're clearly right. I think, there is a bias or presumption in many countries around this scale and complexity that, when you're talking about projects over 500 million with some nature of complexity, the default is you're going to do it as a P3 in many countries, mainly because of exactly what you just described. The U.S., there's still a burden on the advocates of the P3 to overcome the presumption that it's worth doing. Just for whatever reason, those other Western democracies, Canada, we work with we set up the national P3 unit in Canada and McKinsey, we worked with them. That's just the policy of the country now. They wouldn't dream of doing a billion-dollar project and not as a P3.
I just say I sort of agree with all of that, but Tyler, you and I have had this tension for years, but I think that I totally agree that we should do all this stuff. We should do pricing, all this stuff. But it's still, at the end of the day, you have to add capacity. There's no way around it. And this notion, I think we've fallen into this kind of pessimistic, kind of self-doubt thing that we shouldn't or can't add capacity, and then the congestion caucus tells us if we add capacity, it's induced demand and will fill up, which is completely wrong. You look at Washington. They built the Beltway in 1964. Never been widened. You could add 50% capacity expansion to the Beltway. Anybody drive up the BW Parkway? That is a total joke. It's a total joke. You have plenty of room to make that into a 5-lane system each way.
I love capacity. I just wouldn't give it away for free all the time.
No, the point though is you really have to bite the bullet. And the ideal world would be where we're going to go down and do these P3s and this long-term performance thing and all this stuff. The ideal world, you have to build more stuff.
But Rob, it's targeted stuff.
The key though is
the right stuff.
The right stuff.
The right way, all that stuff, with the right price signals, but at the end of the day, we can't pretend that we're going to you have to build more stuff.
And changing some of the presumptions about what kind of stuff you build potentially. The system and the structure of the federal dollars are present is sort of biased towards expanding the interstate, just because of the way the federal aid program works. And that is the bulk of the transportation dollars in the system. If you broaden that out and have federal programs reflect at a greater scale multimodal investment possibilities so that you have more dollars that match and provide optionality, it changes what the kind of default option is in terms of what gets built, potentially.
Yeah, I do still think, regardless, you said this, Tyler, the real problem of congestion is in the top 50 metros in the area. Yeah. And if we had the political will, that's where we should dump a bunch of money, do it the right way and all that stuff. And is that going to solve the problem? No. But if you combine it with congestion pricing and other things, it will make people's lives a lot better.
And so I just want to just echo what Tyler said. I think he's exactly right, which is that there's a lot of unwillingness to provide the money because there's a belief that it will not deliver good projects and good performance. And so it's going to have to come with a set of complementary reforms that people believe. Like you're actually going to have metropolitan planning organizations do real economic analyses of some sort with some name, whether they're cost benefit or whatever, and make them choose based on those. We know Chicago does them, then they throw them out and they do what they want. So that's we're not going to get good use of the money.
Or have private provisioning of projects. That if they want to waste their money, let them waste their money.
The contracts give natural incentives that you don't waste it. So you're trying to build into this sort of more traditional public infrastructure world those kinds of pricing and performance outcomes and planning incentives. I'm all for that.
But
here's the big bottom line that I've seen it around the world, is we're not being honest. Is this really an investment, or are they expenses? And are we funding expenses that we're never going to get the rate of return on?
No, yeah. Are we putting money in that we don't get any return on? Absolutely. But I think the point is, if we did project selection, delivery, and construction better, and you look at our study that we did at the commission, you look at your commission, it's pretty good evidence that there's a lot of projects that are out there that would have a positive ROI better than the cost of capital. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And, so there are lots of projects out there that if you were a rational long-term investor, you would do them. The problem is we don't always do that. We don't have the funding mechanisms for it. But I think to say that this is all spending, I don't agree with that at all. There's lots of things that would have positive societal ROI.
Thank you. Thanks for your presentation. My name is Li Yang. We are talking about PPP especially. And I just wonder, I understand what you say, the government is inefficient and the government is doing a lot of proper lousy job. But my concern is, could you propose any pro and con and see is there any alternative you can do something? Private sectors have a lot of talents, and the government officials, if they don't do it right, you can recommend them to do some improvement. So a lot of charity, they spend a lot of money, hundreds of millions of dollars. Can you ask them to use the money to improve our road or infrastructure instead of use PPP? Because I'm very concerned about PPP. They can be used, abused, all kind of abuse is system-wide, not just to say the dollar, and I'm not talking about just general fund or trust fund. I'm really talking about the real abuse of power and not just resources, like improper accounting, whether in the Department of Transportation or the MVA, they are abused and they can even take a lot of people's resources, a home or house or the cars. So unless you improve this, a government never will do it right. Okay. So if you just say PPP, they will be cause more harm than good. And I didn't hear you say how good is a PPP. Except that, and I think from local to global, including the World Bank, they
yes,
just
I think
promote.
we have the point.
Yeah,
we understand the question.
Yeah, I just say you can improve and make some alternative.
Okay.
Ask the World Bank not to use a PPP.
Okay, so one of the things I would recommend is you read our policy brief that came out today, and part of the, just to be clear, the purpose of a PPP unit within government is to do. And these, as Tyler mentioned, he's actually helped us establish them throughout Canada, Australia, Mexico does them, is to improve the usage of the PPP model. And that basically helps to ensure the public sector that they're doing PPPs properly and help advise the public sector on which projects should be delivered as PPPs and which projects should not be delivered as PPPs. And I think your point about accounting is very important, and that we should use solid accrual-based accounting for taxpayer liabilities, such as for an infrastructure bank. If you're going to develop an infrastructure bank and put risk on the taxpayer balance sheet, I think that risk should be priced at market rates. So I agree with your point, but I would urge you to think about efforts that have already been undertaken to ensure that the PPP model is used in the public interest, right? So we want PPPs to be used in the public interest. This is standard in other sectors of the U.S. economy where the private sector has a big role, like providing electricity. Over half of the generating boilerplate capacity in the United States is provided by investor-owned utilities. So there's a big private role there. We're concerned about pricing electricity properly, maintenance of the asset, service quality. So all these things that we've thought about in utility regulation in other sectors can, I think, be pretty quickly and readily applied in the transportation sector, where we have the public and the private sector cooperating. So I think that my response would be that there are global efforts really to try to use the public-private partnership model in the public interest. And PPP units are not a silver bullet, but they're a tool in the toolkit to try to make the delivery model better. I don't know if others.
Yeah, I
on the
mean,
panel-
one observation is all this is a compared to what question. There's lots of corruption possibilities in a P3 procurement apparatus. There's lots of corruption risk in a traditional procurement. I think the one big thing is in traditional procurement, what nobody ever does is analyze the profit margins or profit achieved associated with everybody who wins in the value chain of a traditional procurement. These are for-profit engineering firms. They're for-profit construction firms. The O&M actually is a lot of times outsourced, whether it's an integrated outsourcing or a stovepipe one. So everybody's making money in this value chain, right? The question on the P3 is, can that model basically force a fight within the integration where those profit and trade-offs, I mean, I've seen it firsthand. We advised a big consortium recently on one of the largest airport privatizations in the world, and the equity investor basically jammed the construction, engineering, O&M firms like I've never seen before. That's basically what the government should be doing in a traditional process to get the best value. But this trade-off should be, is that achieving a better performance outcome because we've got a fight happening in this orbit as opposed to throughout this dispersed procurement? So nobody asked to compare to what question in this arena, you know?
Right. So somebody had a hand up, that gentleman. If you could, again, name and title.
David Austin, Congressional Budget Office, and let me say, Doug, we miss you still. Great.
We all miss Doug.
Did you pay him to come here, Doug?
Yeah. So the last two transportation bills have shown Congress sort of inching its way towards articulating a national freight policy. I don't know what they have in mind or what might be in it, but when I think about what might be in it, I think about maybe separating freight flows from passengers, mostly to speed freight along to its final point, like congestion costs might be high. But and I thought, well, one way to do that, if you do social costing of freight, you know, the trucks and the trains, it would push a lot of freight off the highways and onto the rails. It turns out, I don't think that's really true, at least in today's world. Trucks offer terrific service as it is, so there wouldn't be such shifting. So that suggests maybe dedicated truck lanes, which as an economist, I don't really like that idea. The ones I've seen on the New Jersey Turnpike seem a little bit pointless. But anyway, so my question to you is, to anybody on the panel, a national freight policy, what would you like to see it contain and how might we pay for it?
So I think truck lanes are a dumb idea. It's like
What do you really mean?
trucks drive on roads. So why would you want separate roads? I mean, they're going to be underutilized the vast majority of the time. I think one thing you could do, which we proposed in our commission, you could make trucks pay their fair share. They underpay, which gives them a little bit of an edge over rail, which isn't subsidized, pays its full fare. The second thing, I think what is going to happen in trucks long before we all see our own autonomous vehicles is you're going to see truck platooning with AVs. If you go online, go to YouTube, and there's a great video yesterday of a beer truck delivery, autonomous beer truck delivery. That's exactly what we want and need. But literally, there are companies like Peloton where you could actually you could do Pelotons of 10 trucks where the first truck is the driver and every other truck is an AV. And then they get to some local area, and then another driver comes in. And I think that's going to help a lot with truck throughput and truck costs. So I think the best thing DOT could do would really enable AVs with trucks. And the second thing is I testified in front of Congress on this issue and was uniformly criticized by the trucking industry like 10 minutes after my testimony. They had their statement up. I think we should, if we're going to move to a VMT system, trucks should go first. It's super easy. We could start pricing trucks on a deal. I'm not saying you should even make more money, raise more money, although I think they should. But those would be two important things to do with technology for trucking.
I mean, I think, focus on the big freight bottlenecks and back to the national investment strategy that Doug was talking about. I mean, you have about 5 massive bottlenecks in the United States that contribute, this is 30 to 35% of the country's GDP represented in these regions in Chicago and New York, certainly in Los Angeles, Long Beach. And you just have a lot of inefficiencies associated with private freight rail, you got trucking companies, you got public owners of the roads. I mean, it's there's a problem in efficiency of kind of working that through. And I do think government money, allocated to solving that problem in an effective way could really improve throughput. I think overall the freight railroad system works actually extremely well. When I was in government with Secretary Mineta, we went to China, and they were envious of our freight railroad system. Obviously not our passenger railroad system. And you didn't talk about that much, but they were quite excited about what we'd achieved here, and that's a policy. That was a policy-induced efficiency we've seen on freight rail. I don't think kind of direct subsidies to their business makes a ton of sense. It actually will start to undermine some of this. I mean, one of the things I observed in the last rail 2 cycles ago, but before earmarks were banned, is the freight railroads were getting excited about getting a lot of earmarks.
Right.
We cautioned them to be a little bit careful, because with an earmark comes oversight that they may not want associated with their business. But yeah, I mean, I think the bottlenecks is to me where I would focus if there was capital.
I think that's.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say that I think that identifying the bottlenecks is where the discretionary funding,
Right.
little d discretionary funding that we've had, particularly in the last several years, has demonstrated its effectiveness. If you look like the Chicago example, we've been able to dedicate a pretty substantial amount of funding to the CREATE network, which is targeted directly what you're talking about, because there is the ability to use cost-benefit analysis and choose projects that were kind of targeted in that way. And one of the kind of funding innovations in the FAST Act is a program that allows us to invest in significant freight projects, among others, and kind of the idea behind that is to be sort of matching up significant dollars with identifying where the choke points are.
So I think what everyone said is exactly right. They were inching toward what's the right role. They knew freight had to be on the table, and it does. But it's not for the vast majority of what goes on. It's for these choke points and getting the multimodal stuff ironed out in these congested areas. And I think we're seeing it sort of get there. Now let's just see if they can execute successfully. So they've sort of focused in on the right thing.
So there in the back, gentleman in the back.
Thanks. Zach Israel with the Ferguson Group. So you briefly mentioned earmarks, and my question has to do with what are your thoughts on bringing them back and the likelihood of that, and potential benefits for transportation infrastructure?
So that's a longer discussion, but let me just say this. Distinguish between the episodes where in conference language or on telephones, the appropriators tell an agency how to spend the money versus very targeted. Doug Holtz-Eakin's think tank is going to get $100 million. It's one I think about a lot. It's written into the legislative text. It's passed on the House. It's passed on the Senate. It's signed by the president. That's not an earmark. That's a national priority. And I think we should have zero reservations about doing that, because that means you've identified something very specific that needs to get done. What is untenable and which should not come back is some of the latter forms of broad legislative language with then undercutting all of the selection and performance hopes that we would have tried to have the money achieve. That's not a good idea.
I think, first of all, the earmarks were always overblown in terms of abuse. So a lot of earmark projects were actually good, some were bad. But the thing earmarks do is they bring discipline to the congressional process. You now have a weapon you can use in leadership to discipline recalcitrant members, and now they don't have that. And everybody's just their free agent, and the whole thing breaks down. So I think it's a small price to pay for a little bit of discipline and getting things moving.
There's a different angle on the discipline. The justification for the earmarks that they always gave me was, well, if it's not our earmarks, it's going to be the state's earmarks. Whose do you want, right? So the solution to that is not federal earmarks. The solution to that is having a system that requires people to do real economic analyses of the projects, pick them on the basis of those analyses, have contractual terms where people have to deliver in a sensible time. You know, all of that stuff. Not, well, we'll just control where the money goes, because they're not going to do that, and that's the problem.
Yeah.
I think the flip side of the points about what you've made on the kind of drawbacks of getting rid of them is that in the time since they've been gone, some of that funding has been sort of put towards more performance-based projects. So I think there's a bit of an inverse correlation between when that money was being, in a world of finite resources, the funding being used for earmarks versus being able to kind of have competitive programs where projects that can demonstrate their ability to deliver on the projects, you're able to get the funding. I would say from an execution perspective that we have spent a good deal of time in the last several years dealing with earmark money that was not able to be spent.
Right.
And the fact that there were billions of dollars left on the table from these projects suggests that there were, in many cases, projects getting funding that weren't actually able to deliver on it. So one of the flexibilities that we actually received in the last year's appropriations bill was the ability to allow states to repurpose earmarks that had not been used that sort of met a certain set of criteria to kind of dedicate that funding towards projects in a similar geographic vicinity that they could actually deliver on.
When we left office, there were, I think it was $11 billion of unobligated.
It's whittling down,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
And these are basically earmarks that, you get $50 million or $20 million for a $200 million project that nobody ever gets the rest of it for. It just sits there. I think Senator McCain in his campaign, and I think maybe you encouraged him to talk about that. But that was
could be.
that was an idea to basically, take that money. I mean, we took the $2 billion we did for our urban partnership program was, basically transit money that had been earmarked every year that in the flip over of the Congress, the Democrats just didn't get in office quick enough to take the $2 billion for its normal purposes.
So we
And
just
that was a great program you guys did. It was a fantastic program.
With just a couple minutes left, I actually want to push on Rob a little bit on what I thought was a fascinating issue in our phone conversation that you and I had, which is Rob is a technologist and technology expert, which is the interaction of sort of the evolution of Uber, right? So driverless cars with on-demand technology combined with the issue of road pricing. In other words, I think your point is that you would pay the company for just the use of the driverless Uber vehicle, but built into the price that you would pay would be a charge that company is paying for the road space, presumably on a MBUF or a vehicle miles traveled type fee. And I thought that was fascinating, Rob. And I just sort of, before everybody adjourns, I just wondered if you would be willing to say a few words about, we haven't talked much about driverless cars yet today, and just maybe say a few words about the interaction of that and the funding problem.
So it's a good thing we haven't talked about driverless cars because they tend to suck all the oxygen out of any conversation on transportation technology. And I wrote a piece for the Milken Institute, 2 years ago, looking at what all the economic studies of AVs would be. And if you get to, we estimate, if you get to 90% AV adoption in the US, you save $1 trillion a year. That's serious money. But 700 of that is accident reduction, medical costs. The biggest, if you have kids, the main thing, tell them not to do, don't go and be a body shop repairman or a repair lady, because there'll be very few body shops anymore. But there's about 200, or I can't remember the number, 250 billion of savings from congestion. Because with AVs, the cars, the gap is, first of all, the big problem with congestion is people who slow down too much or drive, stop and go, and that just creates this accordion effect. With AVs, you can get a lot more throughput on any road, and that's money, it's free money, really. You don't have to build something to get that. Yeah. And then secondly, if you combine it with pricing, and then the third thing about sort of these kind of robotic on-demand AV, I mean, why does Uber is cheaper than taxis because they're much more efficient, but a driverless Uber will be even cheaper than a real Uber, and that's going to allow a lot of people to just substitute, and I'm not going to drive that much, and so you'll get a reduction in VMT out of that, particularly if you then add pricing on top of that.
Right.
So that's kind of like an ideal world, but I don't think even though Uber's doing these tests in Pittsburgh now, I'm more skeptical that it's going to be, I think we're at least 15 years away from wanting to go in the car and get drunk and turn the thing on and go home. I mean, you want to be a high risk taker to do that. Ultimately, we probably will get there. A car can just drive itself completely, anytime, regardless of the conditions, but it's going to be a while. It's a hard problem.
We just put out a big mobility report last week. If you guys on the future
You
of
guys
mobility,
did?
yeah. So and McKinsey, you can go to our website. But basically, the massive penetration that a lot of people are talking about is not around the corner. But there are going to be a lot of metropolitan experiments.
Tyler, do you agree with his 15-year number?
Yeah, I think, again, you'll see pockets that are a little faster in terms of for policymakers looking at the national policy questions. That's about right. I mean, I think, but probably Norway and Finland, who always get talked about as the places for experiments, they may be a bit faster. The other big question is, what does it do to the value of time for travelers, which has not gotten a lot of attention. I mean, if you can basically be driving around in a mobile office Does that change value of time? And if it does, that's a huge input to the construction equation right now. So it does, I think you get the doubling of the capacity of the existing roads that he talked about, and then you look at value of time. I don't know. It's a huge disruptive effect. Like we're working at there's a couple big airports that are building big rental car facilities right now. Big question as to whether you need a rental car facility in 20 years. Like,
No.
Any other final comments anyone want to make? So we're a few minutes over, so if people want to ask further questions of our panelists, please do over the remaining wine and cheese that was not consumed by our audience. But thank you all for coming. It was really terrific, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
What do you think about drones either?